So hello everyone. It is a great pleasure and an honor and a privilege to introduce you to Professor Benjamin Poore. He's a professor at the School of Arts and Creative Technologies at York, where he has taught on a wide range of text and performance contexts, from Victorian comedy to contemporary new writing. He has been in service as chair of the Board of Studies, BA program leader, MA program leader, and director of learning and teaching, contributing to curriculum development, among other tasks. He has served as a member of the university's Learning and Teaching Forum, Editing Forum magazine, and he's also led on 2 research projects on dialogic pedagogy. His interests include histories of playwriting and revival, and his current research revolves around the contemporary history play and the relationship between new writing and the representation of the past. He has published widely on the adaptation of texts between page, stage, screen, and on the cultural afterlives of Victorian fictional characters, authors, and other historical figures such as Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Sweeney Todd, Dracula, Queen Victoria, Sherlock Holmes, Oscar Wilde, and Joseph Carey Merrick, among any others. His books include Heritage, Nostalgia, and Modern British Theatre, Staging the Victorians, Palgrave 2012, Sherlock Holmes, From Screen to Stage, Post-Millennial Adaptations in British Theatre, Palgrave 2017, the edited collections Neo-Victorian Villains, Brule 2017, and Contemporary Gothic Drama, Attraction, Consummation, and Consumption on the Modern British Stage, Palgrave 2018. His new monograph, The Contemporary History Play, is due to be published by Nineteenth Drama in 2024. So I have known Ben for several years, and his work, believe me if I tell you, his work has been fundamental in shaping the field of adaptation studies and returning studies. So his research, as I have just read, is groundbreaking. But he's also a very generous and kind and lovely scholar, and it's such a great pleasure for me to be here sharing the table with you.
Thank you, Rosario. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to the conference for inviting me, and to the organizers for your incredible, generous hospitality around the event. I'm returning to speaking about Neo-Victorian matters after about 7 years away, I think. And in that time, as Rosario says, I've been trying to develop my thinking around staging the 19th century past into a wider picture of how we stage the past in any historical period, and what we can learn by looking across at different history plays that use the past as a setting. This has resulted in a book, which will be out next year, and this is close to what the book will look like. So this is the contemporary history play, Staging English and American Pasts, which is coming out with the Methuen Drama Engage series. And I should also say it's appearing at the same time as my colleague Rebecca Benzi's book, which is also in the same series, and which is about feminism, dramaturgy, and the contemporary history play, and which looks at a couple of the plays that I'll be talking about today. So I would very much recommend looking at these 2 books together in tandem for their the ways that they connect to the contemporary history play and questions of women writing women. So I created this very capacious title for the keynote, Women Writing Women, so that I could narrow it down over time. And of course, I began writing this book with a confident idea of the plays that I would be featuring most prominently as case studies. I was sure that I would be writing a chapter on plays that have group narratives, plays that deal with a collective or an ensemble of characters rather than a single figure. And by the time I got to the end of the writing process, lo and behold, those were the very works that I couldn't fit into the structure that I decided on. So here's where we are. Here's why I particularly like to talk about these three plays. The ones that I've decided on today are Blue Stockings by Jessica Swale, which is about the first generation of women to study at Cambridge in the 1890s. Scuttlers by Rona Munro, which is about Manchester street gangs in the 1880s. And The Sweet Science of Bruising by June Wilkinson, which is about women's boxing in the 1860s. With each of these plays having a 19th century English setting, I'm coming back to neo-Victorian drama and testing out some of my ideas from the book that I've just written. And these aren't the only three plays that I could have talked about with regard to group narratives, ensembles, collectives. So for instance, there's Tanika Gupta's The Empress from 2013, a very welcome global and imperial perspective on group narratives, and that was revived earlier this year at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford, and is currently running in London. There's Rough Girls, Tara Lynn O'Neill, sets in Northern Ireland during the First World War, so the historical period is a little bit later. And last year there was Ellen Bramar's play Modest, about the Victorian artist Elizabeth Thompson. So I could have spoken about all those, and I'll maybe touch on those a little bit later, but that's just to kind of give a glimpse of the wider availability of these kind of group narratives, and how I think it's a fertile subject for investigation. And I was able to see the recording of last year's conference keynote by Beth Palmer. And in that keynote, Beth spoke about The Ballad of Maria Martin by Beth Flintoff and Mary Seacole by Jackie Sibley's Drury. And in different ways, those plays bring to life stories of female collectives. So I'm going to apply some of the ideas that hopefully connects to Beth's paper from last year, and maybe this can be seen as a companion to what Beth was saying about these two plays. In what follows, I'm going to be applying some of the ideas of Bertolt Brecht to these plays, to Blue Stockings, to Scuttlers, to Sweet Science of Bruising. Bertolt Brecht, although not a Victorian thinker, a sort of 1920s, 1930s theorist, primarily thought a lot about the way that theatre historicizes. And because I think interesting things happen when we look at the dramaturgy of these plays and how they're taking that legacy into new territory, I thought Brecht was a useful starting point. And I should just clarify, by dramaturgy here, I mean the aesthetic architecture of a play. That's a useful phrase, I think, from Michael Chimers in Ghost Light, his book on dramaturgy. So the aesthetic architecture of a play, the ways that form and content connects and influence each other, and the way that the separate elements of theatre are orchestrated uniquely in each individual play and production. So that's where I'm starting with the term dramaturgy. So there's Brecht, but there's something else that I want to introduce before we get going on these three plays. So in my first book, Heritage, Nostalgia and Modern British Theatre, I wrote about how radical theatre of the 1960s invoked the Victorians as a way of making themselves feel modern in comparison. It was a kind of signifier of modernity to mock the Victorians. But they also referenced the Victorians in theatre as a way of expressing an affection for the period. Sometimes this was an ironic affection, sometimes it was a kind of wistful sense of a world that's been lost. And I thought I'd been quite original at the time in making that observation. No. And particularly, I discovered just very recently, back in 1973, Catherine Worth drew attention to a group of playwrights who drew on, quote, the techniques of the Victorian popular theatre, music hall, farce, pantomime, and melodrama, unquote. And she names those playwrights at the time, this is 1973, as John Arden, Charles Wood, Edward Bond. So I only discovered that Worth had got there before me with this idea many years later, just quite recently. I feel particularly bad about this because Catherine Worth was a professor of drama at my alma mater, Royal Holloway, University of London. In fact, she established the drama degree at Royal Holloway. She was the first professor of drama at the University of London, in which Royal Holloway is a federated member. She was also the first woman in England to hold that title, Professor of Drama. So, as a way of saying sorry to a groundbreaking woman in academia, I want to use a framework that she invented in that 1973 book, Revolutions in Modern English Drama. So she suggested that the new theatre emerging from the late 1960s onwards divides into work of two main kinds. I think I've got this quotation here. Two main kinds: a warm, outward-looking people's theatre of epic and melodrama, and a cool, inward-looking one of black farce and grand guignol, a mystery theatre. So I want to test the three plays I'm looking at against these two kinds of theatre to get a sense of what these writers are doing with the possibilities of the form 50 or 60 years later. And I don't know if we can go back here, just what's on the cover of that 1973 book is from Heathcote Williams' AC/DC, which was a much praised play at the time, and I think was what she meant by an inward-looking theatre of black farce and grand guignol, a mystery theatre. So yes, where are we in 2023? And I'm particularly looking at plays of the 2010s here. So in a way, I'm historicizing these plays of the last 10 years as I go along. So let's begin by looking at some commonalities between these three plays. What makes them worthy of comparison? Well, each one of them culminates in a fight. The riotous behavior of the Cambridge men on the day of the vote on degrees for women in blue stockings. The clash of street gangs and scuttlers is the culminating moments in that play, and the prize fight in Sweet Science of Bruising. And I think this is certainly a reflection of contemporary playwriting teaching, you know, how to structure a play, which calls for a climactic build towards the end of Act 2. And there's a lot that I could say, which I will leave for afterwards for questions perhaps, about the structures of playwriting, how modern plays are shaped, and how if you watch enough neo-Victorian drama, you get a kind of gut feeling for what's about to happen, or the things that that might be coming next, or how long an act has got to run. Because I think these formulas are quite rigorously applied through playwriting programs and through dramaturgy, and it's always a pleasure to see when these things are departed from or subverted, of course. So all three productions also took place in unconventional or adapted theatre spaces. So Blue Stockings in the open-air amphitheatre of Shakespeare's Globe, Scuttlers in the distinctive in-the-round configuration of Manchester's Royal Exchange Theatre, which is built inside the old Exchange building in Manchester, and which opened in 1976. And the Sweet Science of Bruising, originally in Southwark Playhouse, which had been set up with raked banks of seats on four sides, the action kind of taking place in the middle, like a boxing ring. And it was subsequently performed at Wilton's Music Hall a year later. I didn't see the configuration for that, so I'm going to be talking about the Southwark Playhouse kind of boxing ring configuration. So in presenting these ideas of groups and collectives, the audience was more spatially included in the performance than you might expect with end-on or proscenium arch performance. Only in the third of these plays are they actually addressed as an audience within the world of the play at a boxing match. But there is that sense of being surrounded by audience members, of being effectively or close to in the round with all three. And finally, I think it's worth acknowledging, particularly in the light of conversations we've had over the last couple of days, all three of these plays that I'm featuring emphasize youth as productions. These are ensembles showcases perhaps of emerging acting talent. And this, I think, is clearly linked to UK theatre's desire to attract new, younger audiences. The British Theatre Repertoire Report, which was published in 2016, pointed to the dominance of new writing on UK stages, but also to the rarity of second or third productions of new plays. It seems like it's easier to get a play put on the GCSE syllabus for school examination, as has happened with The Empress or Blue Stockings. It's easier to do that than it is to get multiple revivals of these plays. That's partly to do with size of cast, but I'll say a little bit more about this. I'm going to take a slight detour now and talk about a 20th century play, A Taste of Honey by Sheila Delaney. It's written in 1958, so bear with me. This will connect to women staging and restaging the 19th century eventually. So using the magazine Theatre Record as a resource, I've been doing some work on this play with my students. And I looked up how many revivals there have been of A Taste of Honey since 1981, when this resource begins. There have actually only been 10 in, 42 years? Roughly one every 4 years. This is a play that most of my students had studied at school for 2 years. The availability of live recordings of live productions changes the calculus as to how often plays are revived as well, I think. So the last 2 productions of A Taste of Honey have been the National Theatre's revival, originally in 2014, remounted in 2019. And that kind of took the play back to its roots in the 50s. It had the original jazz interludes of scene changes, and that's now available to stream on the National Theatre's at-home platform and through school and university libraries. So does that make it less likely that a play such as that is going to be revived in subsequent years if there is already that resource? So with my students, I discussed the differences between, I suppose, the literary canon as far as drama is concerned, the repertoire. So the difference between the canon, the works that are admired as dramatic literature, and the repertoire, the works that are regularly performed in the theatre today. And with a lot of new historical stage drama, due to costuming, casting, and staging requirements, they seem to be becoming canonical without becoming part of the repertoire. And the ready availability of previous productions means the repertoire is now in competition with what we might call the archive of previous productions that have high quality recordings. So my point is that few of these plays receive professional revivals. So we're more likely to see them as student editions or as study companions. So here's the student edition of The Empress, come out just in time for its absorption into GCSE study. And this has been out for a while, since 2017, a guide to studying and staging Blue Stockings in the Page to Stage series. So we're likely to see these follow-ups, these subsequent editions, rather than subsequent productions. It's true that The Empress has been revived after 10 years by the same company, the Royal Shakespeare Company, that staged it originally. And I guess that's one of the few institutions that has the resources to be able to do that. And there's the additional security of knowing that it's now a set text. But this is a difficult calculus. You know, these are plays with big casts. Do we see them being produced again and again professionally? Or are they released into the schools and education system, and every production afterwards is an amateur production, a college production, something for assessment? Is that how they continue to have an afterlife, rather than as traditionally was the case, that they would get subsequent revivals? So I'll keep coming back to this question of the commercial context of theatre and how these plays sit in the expectations of how venues and institutions fund themselves and perpetuate themselves, because I think this is crucial. But I'm going to talk a bit more about Blue Stockings now. So Blue Stockings had its first performance at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, RADA, in 2012. And Jessica Swale, the playwright, subsequently rewrote it and staged it at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in 2013. Since then, it's been widely produced by amateur and school groups. Images from some of these productions are reproduced inside the Page to Stage volume. And like Emilia by Morgan Lloyd Malcolm, which premiered at Shakespeare's Globe in 2018, Blue Stockings is a production that takes pride, I think, in speaking to a larger constituency of women in the community. And both plays also address the historic shortage of strong women's roles in the kinds of plays that are often studied and performed. Blue Stockings tells the story of the early years of Girton College, Cambridge, a women's college that began 30 miles outside Cambridge in Hitchin and is now, at the time of the play's starting, on the outskirts of the city. It's 1896, and a vote is approaching on whether women should be permitted to take degrees. The action of the play follows these 4 young women through their first year at Girton as they navigate the unwelcome attention and mockery of male students and academics as they're chaperoned through public spaces and in the college itself by Miss Bott to ensure respectability, and as they bond as a group over shared hardships. The play's climax is the university vote. All graduates are eligible to cast a vote, and so the town is flooded with men who've travelled down intending to vote the proposal down. Swale explains that one of the points of inspiration for the book was a photograph which is reproduced in the Page to Stage book of a blue stocking on a bicycle being burned in effigy on the day of that vote, which is reproduced and highlighted as a point of creative inspiration. Alongside this public story of riots and criminal damage as varsity men run amok, we have the personal story of Tess, who is rightmost, I think, here in this picture, who falls in love with an undergraduate called Ralph, and because he breaks her heart the night before her viva voce examination, she is the only one of her cohorts to fail her exams. She is, however, exceptionally allowed to return the following year to resit her examination, but that's where the play ends, with the promise of being able to go back next year and resit. There are 2 main tutors featured at Girton in the play, Mrs. Welch and Miss Blake, who represent 2 different approaches to the question of degrees for women. Mrs. Welch is a gradualist, degrees by degrees, she says, while Miss Blake is more outspoken and wants to make the Girton students, wants to take them to a suffragist meeting, for example. The teaching is aided by Mr. Banks, who's standing here next to the bicycle, who teaches the rest of the time at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he reveals his support for women being awarded degrees. And at that point, his offer of a fellowship is rescinded and he loses his job. And Miss Blake also resigns her position by the play's end. So there are clearly professional consequences for taking a stand in this play. The students are Celia Wilbond, who's described as a fragile hard worker, according to the script, and she's the one struggling with the bicycle, I think, here. Carolyn Addison on the left, an early bohemian. Tess Moffat on the right, our central character, described as a curious girl, and Maeve Sullivan, a working class student who has a scholarship, and in the Globe production she's presented as coming from Belfast, with a brother who works on the shipyard. So that's the young woman at the back behind the bicycle. So the difficulty of structuring a group drama play like this is readily apparent in the scripts. Jessica Swale is quite open in the Page to Stage book about these problems. I learned, she says, as I went from draft to draft, that it's easier to tell a complicated story through a single perspective. The audience really wants to invest in one person's story, The Rada version gave equal weight to the four women's stories, but I felt that there was too much going on, and we never really got to know any one of the girls well enough. It was a shame not to write more for Celia, Carolyn, and Maeve, but I wanted the clarity of emotional journey that you get from following one person in particular. And through Tess, we encounter the others. That's what she writes. Swale is open about the fact that she was also writing a film at the same time, a film of Blue Stockings. Quote, I wanted the play to be more filmic, and films are almost always focused through one character's perspective, unquote. In addition to the challenge of including all the women studying and teaching at Girton, Swale's play also included a group of 5 male students, Ralph, Lloyd, Holmes, Edwards, and Will. And as a result of this, stage time is limited even for the other Girton women. Maeve is forced to leave at the end of the first act and is never heard from again. Celia and Carolyn disappear from the story once they've passed their exams. And Tess has a little more of a backstory. So she and Will are both from the same village, and she seems to have had a fractious relationship with her father, to whom Will had made a promise to look after and be responsible for her. But I find myself curious about Tess's class background. If she is presented as the every woman through whom we meet the others, what is the nature of her typicality? And Will's status in this Victorian world was similarly unclear to me. He seemed very keen to get on in life. He insists that, quote, I need to earn a living. Employers want firsts, unquote. A sentiment that's echoed by one of the other undergraduates when he confronts the women in a haberdashery shop and says, quote, we are the future, the leaders, the establishment. We don't sleep, we don't rest, and we don't give up, and we don't come second. We learn, unquote. Mr. Banks, the Trinity tutor, is at one point congratulated by the other lecturers at the college on having performed miracles by putting his male students on track for firsts, which puts the college, quote, at the top of the league, unquote. So the play gives a strong sense of competition for resources. The men resent sharing even a fraction of their advantages in a patriarchy with women, who, after all, they say, won't need their learning because the profession will be closed to them. And anyway, they can always marry and have children and should do so immediately. But I found being unable to place these characters in the class system made it difficult to appreciate the stakes fully. If Lloyd and his friend are the establishment, if, as we discover at the end of that haberdashery scene, Lloyd's father is the landlord who owns the haberdashery building, why do they need to work so hard? And these are not so much historical questions, although I'd be very interested if people can fill in the history afterwards, as dramaturgical ones at the moment that I'm asking. So I could be wrong in my sense that late Victorian Oxbridge undergraduates in the vein of Charlie's aunt don't particularly care about getting the best grades, but valued the social connections that university offered more. Perhaps Victorian England was on the cusp of a significant social change where credentialism began to replace hereditary entitlement as the key to career success for the sons of the gentry and the aristocracy, perhaps, but the play doesn't show us that. It's content to merge, I think, one form of hereditary privilege with a male privilege that disguises itself as meritocracy. So my view is that the play's overriding interest is in showing how like ourselves these 1890s women are, or how like the modern women's audience these 1890s women are, and how unchanging expressions of male privilege are. Women are still having to be twice as good to be rewarded half as much. There's a sequence in which Tess is systematically talked over and pathologized by Dr. Maudsley in a lecture theatre, which feels very contemporary still. So women are characterized as being emotional from the outset. When they object to that, they're told that their reaction only confirms their emotionality and their lack of control. And it's infuriating, and we're meant to find it infuriating. And I think we're meant to recognize that that is something that still happens today. But by pushing those contemporary connections so hard, I think the play doesn't historicize in that Brechtian sense. It doesn't pull us up short with a sense of how different the past was, how different people were then. Brecht's overriding concern being to emphasize that human nature is not the same from era to era. It changes according to political circumstances. So Brecht, in defining historicization, actually uses the example at one point of a young woman leaving home, which is the situation that all of these Girton women find themselves at the beginning of the play. So quoting Brecht here, the theatre concentrates entirely on whatever in this perfectly everyday event is remarkable, particular, and demanding inquiry, unquote. In other words, how unusual was it for this to happen in this time and place? Quote Brecht again, do children always make themselves independent? Did they do so in every age? Unquote. So those are the things that Brecht wants to know about the action of a woman leaving home in the history play. And those are the questions that I feel are somewhat missing in Blue Stockings. Okay, let's move on to Scuttler's second play, which I've written about previously, but I'm revisiting in the light of these new connections. So Scuttler's imagines the lives of the teenage street gangs of Ancoats in Manchester in the 1880s. And it follows the rivalry between the Bengal Street Tigers and the Prussia Street gang, which culminates in a bloody confrontation. Unlike in Blue Stockings, the characters are not sex segregated, but instead the play's historical intervention is that it writes women back into a narrative from which they've previously been erased. The play's publicity and the text's cover, unfortunately, implied that this was mostly a male story, with women and girls as hangers-on. In fact, the play distributes its male and female parts pretty equally, for teenage boys and girls. So the way it's publicized and the range of publicity photographs available plays heavily on this Peaky Blinders idea of male gang members squaring up to each other. And that's not actually the play. The play has these four significant female characters, but this is what we see a lot of. And here again, you've got two males and a female, Rona Morrison here kind of on the edge, and actually she's a pretty central character. So the way that it's framed on the front of the play script, just zooming in on that, distorts what I think the play really is about and the intervention that it makes. Okay. So Teresa here, I struggled to find decent photographs of her, but here's Teresa on the left. She's left to look after her four sisters when her mother dies and her brother runs away. And she is now the girlfriend of the gang leader, Sean. And she is insistent on questions of consent, sexual consent, just because she is girlfriend doesn't mean that she is sexually available. So her friend Margaret kind of intervenes at one point and says, you don't get it, do you? She chooses, not you. And Margaret is introduced as the newest member of the Bengal Tigers, having run away from home and from an abusive stepfather and a disbelieving mother who doesn't believe the abuse is taking place. And so one of the first things we see is the gang kind of led by Teresa, jumping the stepfather as he leaves the pub and beating him up. So the female gang members really lay into him and use their collective strength to beat seven bells out of him. There's also the character of Susan. She works in the Ancoat dispensary, which is treated as by the play's residents as a kind of accident and emergency ward. And then there's Polly, who is the Bengal Street gang's mascot. Apparently, she wears boys' clothes and declares furiously at one point, "I ain't a little girl." However, After the humiliation of being forced into a lurid dress by a rival faction of her own side, her own gang, Polly, is the one character who most decisively rejects the world of the street gangs at the end of the play. Her gender nonconformity is laid aside as she says, "When I'm 15, I can start as a policewoman. They get a uniform, they get a stick. I know where you all sleep, and I'll come back and hit all of you with that stick. Just you wait." Teresa here is such a powerful presence in the first half of the play. She's dancing, she's flexing her power and confidence, she's taunting people. We might expect the play to conclude with her being head of the gang. However, it's actually the narrative of Thomas Clayton here in the middle. It's this bouncy, scrappy unknown that Teresa takes under her wing, and for whom she possibly has romantic feelings. But it follows Thomas Clayton's path towards the end of the play. And in the climactic fight, Thomas stabs Joe, Teresa's long-lost brother, who you see in army uniform here. And he actively seeks to be arrested for it. He's like telling the police, "I did it, it's me, arrest me." He actively seeks to be put away and isn't worried. He says if he's hung for the murder, as long as people remember his name, which was also his father's name, Thomas Clayton, he insists over and over again. And by contrast, we lose track of Teresa several scenes before the end of the play. She's last seen at the dispensary with Susan. Of course, her brother has been brought there and died. And Susan tells her, "You can sit with Joe till I'm done here. Then you can help me lay him out. We'll talk after that if we've strength for it." So despite the fiery blaze of the opening scenes, the end of the play follows that familiar trajectory of the gangster movie. Thomas Clayton as another Scarface, a Henry Hill, a Benny Blanco from the Bronx, seeking to make and mythologize his own name. The girls and women are repositioned in the traditional roles of nurse, mother, sister, mourner, bystander, cleaner up of men's mess. I think this is the point that Munro is making with the play, and the waste, the triumph of pointless male bravado is meant to make us angry. But as always in history plays, there's a tension between what the play wants, the forces that the play has set in motion, and what the historical record will allow. As Munro says in the author's note, quote, "These were real lives, they deserve a real voice," unquote. As with Blue Stockings, we can see at a distance of some 8 years now, how the play is also a historical document of the 2010s, as well as a theatrical account of Victorian history. So the emphasis on consent recurs throughout the play, an echo of the Me Too and Time's Up periods of feminist activism. We're also told at the very start of the published text that, quote, "Scuttlers was written in response to the street riots of 2011, unquote. I spoke to Suzanne Bell, the dramaturg or literary manager at the Royal Court at the time, and she recalled that the rehearsal process began with an exercise where the company were asked to read newspaper accounts of the riots and try and work out if those accounts were from 2011 or from the 1880s. So Munro is clear about her intention to make the play be about both then and now simultaneously. Hence, aspects of the costuming mix the look of youth gangs then and now in a very stylized way. As Munro states, quote, "The events and characters of the play are based on events and characters from 1884 to the present day. Scuttlers is therefore intended to be of its time, but of our time too," unquote. With this in mind, it's not quite an act of Brechtian historicization, I'd say, since it's seeking to strategically merge the two periods rather than to create a marked distinction between them. Instead, the play's ending deploys Carol Churchill-style dramaturgy of haunting, a representation of haunted ground rather than a rationalist, realist analysis. So, at the end, we have Polly rushing about as a whole series of actors kind of walk across the stage, and she's shouting, "Don't walk there, a man died there, that's a man's blood." And she's disappearing amongst all these bodies crossing the stage, the sea of bodies. They're hurrying about their business. They're in modern day costumes. Some of them are still in elements of their Victorian costumes. They're looking at something on their phones. You know, they're distracted. They're not noticing the ground that they're walking on. This is in the Manchester production. Nevertheless, I think Scuttlers does contain that sense of historicisation of characters in the class structure that I felt was missing from Blue Stockings. The world that these gang members inhabit, the choices that they have are very clearly evoked, from abusive step-parents to parents who died young, leaving a large family of infants, from the flop houses with many strangers sleeping in a room to the relentless noise of the mills, all taking place inside the actual exchange building itself where cotton was traded. So moving on to a third play. There we are. The Sweet Science of Bruising by June Wilkinson. So I've taken the plays in chronological order of staging in the 2010s. So my third play is as you can see, a boxing play. However, as is often the case, the early drafts of this play predated Blue Stockings, and June Wilkinson says in the foreword to the play text that she'd wanted it to be produced in time for the 2012 Olympics, which didn't happen. What's also interesting in relation to Blue Stockings is Wilkinson's attitude to the single protagonist idea that I quoted Jessica Swale quite extensively on. So June Wilkinson recalls being told when she was at the BBC Writers' Academy that, quote, a well-told story should only have one protagonist, or perhaps a group protagonist, as long as they acted as a team with a shared goal, unquote. So we might think here of neo-Victorian team stories and series like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Penny Dreadful, or The Irregulars, each in a different way, a kind of mash-up adaptation of different sources, and each borrowing too, I think, from the Marvel and DC superhero franchises, the Avengers, Justice League, Suicide Squad. To hell with that, says Wilkinson. Quote, I thought, sod it. I'm going to write a play with 4 female protagonists and give them all their own stories so that even if you identify more with one, you understand them all. So this is rather different from Jessica Swale's choice, faced with the same scriptwriting advice. She decided to write the play as more filmic, allowing us to get to know the other women through Tess. Wilkinson gives the 4 women equal weighting. Unlike Swale and her Globe connection, so Jessica Swale was an associate director at the Globe when Blue Stockings was put on. And unlike Rona Munro, who at the time of Scuttlers was a well-established playwright, Wilkinson describes how she took on multiple projects for film and TV and theatre and radio, whilst hoping that, quote, my lady boxing play, unquote, might one day be produced. So Ashley Cook, who was a producer at the theatre company Troupe, was the person who championed the play and introduced it to the person who was eventually its director and dramaturg, Kirsty Patrick Ward. The play also had input from the dramaturg Lloyd Trott at RADA, who gave the irresistible quote that Sweet Science is one of the first post-Octoroon dramas. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but maybe we can mull over that later. Wilkinson adds, this is again in the foreword, quote, the Globe's production of Emilia brought an all-female take on the Shakespearean era, and now here we are bringing you our 4 Victorian boxing heroines, playing with the form of the period drama to put different stories on stage and ask questions about how we live now, unquote. So that association with Emilia comes through strongly here as well. That reference to asking questions, and the foreword then goes on to ask a series of key questions about the individual versus the collective. That asking questions feels very Brechtian in the way that I quoted Brecht on historicisation earlier. So it probably won't be a surprise that I'm going to argue that Sweet Science is the most Brechtian of the 3 plays that I'm analysing here. In his theoretical writings, Brecht argued that going to the theatre should not be like going to church or to court or to school. Going to the theatre should be like attending a sporting event, not to watch wrestlers flashing biceps, but to witness subtler contests, ones fought with words. There are always at least two people on the stage, and they are usually engaged in some kind of struggle. You have to watch closely to see who wins. And that's from Theatre as Sport. What I admire about Sweet Science is that it makes that metaphor concrete, imbuing the theatrical form with its content. The whole playing space is effectively a sporting arena. It's 1869, and Professor Charlie Sharp is the manager of the Angel Amphitheatre in Islington. And he begins as our master of ceremonies at the start of the play, introducing each of the boxers in turn as if to a boxing audience, and each is individually and rather incongruously announced as the lady boxing champion of the world. We're shown these vignettes of their previous lives. Each is given an origin story of how much of them and how each of them became involved in the world of women's boxing. So we're introduced to Violet Hunter, who's here reading from the book, who works as an assistant to Dr. James Bell, but who wants to gain her own medical qualification in Paris, following in the footsteps of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Violet is currently dependent on her Aunt George, who's a progressive woman, but unlike Mrs. Welsh in Blue Stockings, she's but like Mrs. Welsh, she's a gradualist. She's a believer in reform by degrees rather than taking revolutionary steps. We also meet Matilda Mattie Blackwell. She's a resourceful Irish prostitute who begins an affair with Gabriel Lamb, and she's right at the back here with fist raised. When we meet our third boxer, it's Gabriel Lamb's wife, Anna Lamb, who is seated in this picture, whose comfortable upper middle class background belies the reality of living according to the whims of her husband, who's violent and controlling and unfaithful. And finally, we meet Polly and Paul Stokes from a mining community in the north of England, and you can see Polly on the side here in the red skirt. So they're raised as brother and sister. They're not related by blood, and they leave for London at the professor's encouragement. Paul is the one who's expected to have a successful career in boxing. When Polly's career takes off and his doesn't, Paul becomes resentful and violent, leading to their breakup. So as the play progresses, the women learn to introduce and mythologize themselves for the boxing audience. Rather than being presented by the professor, they present themselves. So by Act 2, Scene 2, Mattie is presenting her boxing persona using the narrative formulas available in the period. So she says, "Gentlemen, welcome. No ladies allowed, except me. For this is my story, the tragic tale of a poor Irish girl born into squalor and wronged by the squire. She poses as if acting in a burlesque tableau, a damsel succumbing to her seducer." And so it goes on. Sweet Science turns the theatre space into a boxing ring, but also theatricalizes boxing, drawing to our attention how theatre and boxing have in common many things, particularly in this period. In addition to these meta performances of melodrama, we see Violet at the theatre with her Aunt George and Sister Emily watching a pastiche of a cup and saucer drama. And the plot with Gabriel and Anna is more like a grimly realist version of Patrick Hamilton's play Gaslight. So we've got all of these strands combining. In this case, it ends very badly. Anna is operated upon as a hysteric. She has her children taken away and is on the verge of being committed to an asylum when she attacks and kills Gabriel, for which she's hanged. So throughout the play, what I noticed was the extreme economy of June Wilkinson's writing, along Brechtian principles, I would say. So Polly and Paul, this is Polly again, talk about their plans while they're sparring. And at the end of that sparring scene, where there's physical action and dialogue, the professor has seen all he needs to see, and we as an audience have heard all we need to hear. And he invites them back to London with him. That's Act 1, Scene 4. In another scene, Dr. Bell and Violet both propose to each other at exactly the same moment, meaning that they then have to take a step back and unpack their motivations for getting married, rather than the usual expectation that they both spend a long time working themselves up to the question. It sort of has the question and then we work our way back and find out the motivation. So there's a great economy in that, I think. There's a moment with Aunt George and Violet practicing fencing while Violet's sister Emily reads from her draft novel, with the fencing moves mirroring the direction of the conversation. So often something physical and something intellectual are being overlaid and juxtaposed. There's also a lot of mirroring in the dialogue. So characters pick up each other's words, turn them around in a display of verbal sparring. And I've just picked out one example here. So this is between Polly and Violet just after Violet has come to be a stand-in doctor at the boxing match and then eventually becomes a boxer herself. I know they had lass doctors down here, meaning in London. Ladies, I mean. No, well, I wasn't aware of lady boxing champions before tonight either. I'm not a proper boxing champion, not yet. I need the world to catch up with me. I'm not a proper doctor yet either. I had to borrow this bag. The professor reckons it might be years till I get the chance to be a champion. My aunt thinks I'll never get the chance to be a doctor, but we'll show them, won't we? In this way, the rhyming or complementary characteristics of each woman's life are set out for us, and the process also points out their differences. The climax of the play is the last championship match, one last fight, with the prize money going for to one of the women to enable her to live independently. The play throughout puts the women's individual needs in tension with their social roles and their felt responsibilities to siblings, aunts, children, and husbands, and to their talents and desires. It might be that the play makes a rather safe choice by having the winner of the last fight be Violet, who is the one character who's seeking out professional training and a middle-class career as a doctor. But the means by which she gets there is quite unpredictable. Not only does she have to save her pregnant opponent's life after knocking her down and stopping her heart, but she also has to deal with the sudden news that even the modest inheritance that she was relying upon has been spent secretly by her aunt on her own medical bills. It's a genuinely complex situation in which there can be no winners, and she faces that conversation moments before she's due to go into the ring and fight. So maybe there's something a little bit familiar about the women rallying together to organize one last fight with the professor, because the professor at this point is down on his luck because women's boxing has become so popular that he's losing out financially. And in terms of restaging the 19th century, this play is not Mary Seacole, for instance, that Beth talked about last year. It doesn't present us with the challenge of working out when and where we are in each scene, as Jackie Sibley's Drury's play does. It doesn't deal in hauntings or possession, in the fantastic, in alternate histories. But for a play that stays with one reality, one world of the play, and provides a single dramatic through line, I think it's a very accomplished piece. It's about as accomplished as a piece as you'd find anywhere. It shows an awareness of its own theatricality. It acknowledges its own audience. It offers complex dialectics, and it uses the full resources of the theatre. It's not Brecht's theatre as sport, because in that model, the characters only spar verbally. Instead, it makes content work as form, and also asks us if the logic of that form, the boxing competition, should be how we think of drama and how we think of life. As Aunt George says to Violet, no, be honest, it's futile. You can't win for yourself and still care for others. So the ending is politically bittersweet. Yes, Violet does find a way to win and still care for others, but she's still stepped into a working class world as a middle class woman, learned the skills, used her knowledge and her extra leisure time to become the best, and has walked away with the prize money. So there are complexities there that I really appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to conclude now. So I'm bringing it all together and reminding ourselves of Catherine Worth's two types of post-1960s theatre: the outward-looking people's theatre of epic and melodrama, and the inward-looking one of black farce and grand guignol, the mystery theatre. What kind of theatre are we seeing dominate the 2010s when it came to restaging the 19th century? Certainly, Scuttlers and Sweet Science of Bruising contain their own doses of grand guignol, of gritty realism. But I don't think any of the plays are inward-looking, even when Blue Stockings channels the action through the eyes of Tess. Thinking back to Mary Seacole, that play that Beth talked about last year, I'd say it's more in the line, that play is more in the line of black farce and grand guignol. But I resist the idea that the multiple Marys in Mary Seacole are inward-looking. So even that doesn't quite fit the formula. I'd suggest that all three plays about groups and gangs that I've been discussing today are inheritors of a different classification, the outward-looking people's theatre of epic and melodrama. Come to think of it, Worth's phrasing suggests to me Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop, famous for its production of Oh, What a Lovely War in 1963. But Littlewood was also the director who put her faith in Sheila Delaney's A Taste of Honey in 1958. And I think that the original staging of that play too is outward-looking, epic and melodramatic. And indeed, Worth talks about Theatre Workshop in a chapter of the book I mentioned. Furthermore, Littlewood's Theatre Workshop drew inspiration from the theatre of Bertolt Brecht, Erwin Piscator, Ernst Toller, and so on. So yes, these three women playwrights are reinterpreting Brecht, but doing so through Littlewood and Theatre Workshop, who popularized this style in England. And what these three women playwrights do with their setting is to adopt, to varying degrees, the staging techniques of epic theatre. This, I think, is at its most accomplished in the case of Sweet Science. It absorbs epic theatre's sporting metaphors into its own dramaturgy. And this seems to fit with my larger theory about the contemporary history play, which is that it's a more hybridized form now, mixing strands of biography and fiction, multiple historical periods, and elements of the fantastic. The 2020s are not the 2010s, of course, and it remains to be seen whether there's room in the theatre ecology for these relatively large cast plays since COVID and with UK theatre in its second decade of funding cuts. It's troubling that despite the critical and commercial success of Amelia, for example, Shakespeare's Globe has steered clear of main stage new work since then, confining its new plays to the Sam Wanamaker Theatre, their indoor space. But these three plays show the exciting possibilities of a form of historical theatre that's based on collective action and social connection rather than the exceptional individual. It feels like in the 21st century, epic theatre has arrived via the 19th century. However, it will require collective action on the parts of companies, venues, and funders to continue this trend. Thank you.
Thank you for this absolutely fascinating talk, Ben, and I'm sure we have questions, comments on the floor. We'll have time for a couple of questions, at least. Yeah. Kate.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for the name check to Beck's work, because I supervised the PhD that was based on. I've got two questions, I suppose. One is to just comment on your final ending about the 2 decades of cuts. This time last year, we were hearing from Polly Teal, who ran the most wonderful company, Shared Experience, which worked on 19th century material. We've also lost Emma Rice's Knee High, which also worked on 19th century material. My comment, I suppose, or my question is about the first performance of Blue Stockings, which strikes me that Swale is writing about her experience at Exeter. The young male students, you know, it could be a description of boys from business school, quite frankly, where she was an undergraduate at the University of Exeter. But what do you think? How do you think that play is inflected by its first performance in a very deliberately, consciously, archaeologically recovered historical space of the globe, which is a different kind of historical recovery than the kind that you're talking about? It's something Beck and I discussed a lot, so I'm interested in your take on that.
Yes, thanks, Kay. Yeah, there's quite a lot in the Page to Stage book about the production design of the globe and how it was conceived, and how the set dimensions were used, and how certain angles were cheated in order to make things work. When I saw it, I was at the far extreme end in an upper gallery. So I think when the great banner was unfurled at the end, I was practically behind it, so I couldn't see what it said. And that struck me as an example of how that particular staging, which struck me from where I was sitting as being quite an attempt to impose an end-on kind of more 19th century staging configuration onto the globe. And I didn't feel that worked, and yet I've been sort of fighting with my own thoughts. Is it me that's expecting something that's set in the late 19th century to mimic the staging conventions of that period? Am I just thinking about it wrongly, or was there something about it that felt like it was at odds with that space? And particularly, yes, that idea of the individuated character and the sense of the filmic, which again feels very unglobe. So yes, I've been wrestling with that too. But yeah, my experience was that from certain angles, that there was a point at which the end-on staging became something you were sitting behind.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know how coherent I'm going to be about this, but we've heard a lot this morning about neo-Victorian bodies that exist in the space of the radical or the subversive, and I think we want to localize ourselves in those spaces, right? No one particularly seems to want to set the neo-Victorian smack dab in middle-class normalcy. And I wonder, I'm thinking about what there is, particularly in dramatic narrative terms, that's packed into that as a sort of consoling fiction, right? That we would have found ourselves in the radical space rather than the reactionary space, particularly in a moment where we're negotiating polarized politics and that kind of thing. That didn't even turn into a question, but thoughts?
Yes, I can certainly see that, particularly with Blue Stockings. It is kind of inviting us to side with that cohort and to think ourselves into, okay, so what's our battle? What's the next battle? What's the next setback? And always kind of proceeding in that. I suppose it's that idea of historical progress again, isn't it? Reasserting itself that things will get better. You know, it's one step forward and two steps back. So there is an idea, particularly with Blue Stockings, of historical progress and let's all imagine ourselves as being on the progressive side. With Scuttlers, I guess it's more a merging or a circularity or a spiral, as we were talking about earlier, where we are in the Victorian era, but we're also looking at how things haven't changed at all, and we're looking at similar problems of deprivation, and we're thinking, is this progress? Is this really? And I'm not sure how much it's intentional with Sweet Science of Bruising as to whether we are meant to feel that uncomfortable sense of, we thought we were the rough and tumble working class boxers, but it turns out we're the middle class doctor at the end, scooping everything up and going off to a career. I'm not 100% sure if that's how we're being positioned, but I think that is quite an interesting rug pulling moment in terms of encouraging us as spectators to be aware of our own positionality and to say, okay, so this is how the story ends. How does that position you? Which I think is quite a bold thing to do.
Absolutely. So I think we should put an end, and perhaps you could also continue conversations over lunch. Thank you so much, Ben, for your